The first thing you need to know is that I never expected the sound of gushing water to become the loudest declaration of war my neighborhood would ever witness, because the moment I hit the switch and my well pump thumped to life, I had no idea that across the street Karen, with her binoculars permanently glued to her face, was already sprinting to her porch like she had just spotted a national security threat, and before I could even fill a single glass, she was screaming from her driveway that I was stealing water from the HOA, and the insanity of it all hit me like a bucket of ice as her voice echoed through the quiet morning, and my mind tried to process how in the world someone could think a well that sat on my property since long before the HOA even existed somehow belonged to them. But Karen was already marching down my gravel path, clipboard in one hand, phone in the other, yelling that she would shut me down, and I could feel a weird mixture of humor and stress boiling in my chest. Because if this woman wanted a fight, she had just kicked off the opening bell in spectacular fashion, and I knew then that this was not going to be one of those neighbor squabbles that faded with time. This was going to be a full-scale aquatic war, and she wanted to be the general. I tried to explain it calmly, telling her this was a private well drilled by the original owner years before the subdivision was built, and I was just maintaining my own legally registered water supply, but she rolled her eyes so dramatically that if sarcasm generated electricity, the whole block would have been fully powered, and she declared the HOA rules stated all water on the property belonged to the association, so I needed to shut it off immediately and connect to city water like everyone else, because things had to be equal for the greater good. And she said that without a drop of shame, even though 5 houses down she had secretly installed an unapproved fountain that sprayed water into the street 3 times a day for her ducks. But logic was not welcome here, only Karen logic, and that means nonsense is law. I laughed by accident, and that only fueled her wrath more, because she stepped even closer, pointing at the well cap like it was a bomb, and yelled that she had already called the HOA board, and they were issuing emergency citations as we spoke, and if I refused to comply they would come out with a lock and padlock my well shut, which sounded funny, until she added that the HOA president was her best friend and together they could make my life hell. And the look in her eyes told me she was not exaggerating or bluffing. She really wanted control of my water, maybe not the water but the power, because she thrived on control like oxygen. I took a deep breath, trying not to lose it, but the more she spoke the more she twisted the story into some heroic act of hers to protect the community from my dangerous water source that had been working perfectly fine for 20 years, and she started waving at passing neighbors, screaming that I was hoarding water just for myself, and soon a few curious faces peeked from behind curtains, as if I was running some illegal water empire underground. She pulled out her phone and snapped photos like she was documenting a crime scene while demanding I show her permits, and when I said she had no authority to request any document from me, she smirked and said the HOA had total jurisdiction over all land, water, air, and community ambience, which made me almost choke, trying not to laugh again. But before I could respond she shouted that she would get the state involved, claiming I was contaminating the area with unregulated groundwater, and her voice cracked with the thrill of filing complaints, and that was the moment I realized this was not going to end through calm discussion, because once Karen gets a crusade in her head, nothing short of a meteor impact could stop her. She turned dramatically and marched away, dialing numbers, probably the HOA board, the police, the president of Earth, who knows, and every step she took kicked up tiny clouds of dust like dramatic exit smoke, perfectly choreographed by her own ego, and I stood there staring at my well like it had just personally offended her ancestors. The rest of the morning turned into a circus, because within an hour a couple of board members walked over in matching shirts, acting like they were there on official government business, and they tried to tape a violation notice to my fence, except they messed up the tape twice, and it kept dangling, but they still glared at me with the intimidation skills of a damp sponge, and told me my private well was hereby classified as common property and subject to HOA assessment, meaning they wanted to control it and charge everyone for water usage, including me, on my own land, and the absurdity was so ridiculous I almost felt like I was on a hidden camera show. But no, this was real life in an HOA where power-hungry neighbors can decide that your water, your money, and your sanity belongs to them. I told them firmly that the well was grandfathered in and legally documented long before this community existed, but they flipped through their rule binder like it was the constitution of the universe, and the HOA president smugly repeated that everything within the subdivision boundaries belonged to the HOA if they said so because rules evolve, and she said that phrase like it was a sacred quote from a prophet. I refused to sign anything and warned them this was trespassing and harassment, but they ignored it and left the papers blowing like trash on my driveway, and when I picked them up I noticed they listed fines for every single day I continued to operate my own well, and at that moment the humor started slipping away, replaced by a pulsing anger, because this was crossing the line from annoying to legally dangerous. As the sun dipped low I stood by the well pump listening to the rhythmic hum that had once been a peaceful reminder of independence, and now sounded like a battle drum announcing the start of a war I never asked for but had no choice but to fight, because if Karen wanted my water then she had just leaked more than she knew. She had opened the floodgates, and she was about to drown in consequences, since the last person she should ever challenge is someone who actually understands property rights better than the entire HOA combined, and as night settled I could already see how tomorrow would play out. She would escalate again, maybe with threats, maybe with authorities, but she had no idea that the state took one look at this well and saw something she would hate more than anything, a private utility, which meant instead of taking my water she might soon find herself paying me for every single drop. As the sun rose the next day I was already awake, because a restless night filled with thoughts of ridiculous HOA wars had turned my bed into a battlefield, and I stepped outside with coffee in hand ready to protect my well from any more nonsense, but what I saw almost made me spit my drink out, because Karen and 2 HOA board members were standing right next to my well holding a giant red lock like they were about to shut down a crime scene, and Karen was waving a laminated sheet like a holy proclamation declaring the well officially seized by the HOA, and from now on any usage of water would require HOA approval, fees, documentation, and possibly her personal signature, because she apparently believed she was the queen of hydration and everyone else just lived in her watery kingdom, and the fact that these people thought they had actual authority made me laugh hard enough that Karen's face turned a deeper shade of tomato fury as she screamed that laughter was not allowed during legal enforcement. I walked toward them calmly and asked what grounds they had to trespass and attempt to shut off my private utilities, but the HOA president proudly tapped the laminated page and claimed that Rule 41B under Section 6 allowed the HOA to take control of community shared resources, and that included waterways, fountains, ponds, and wells, and I reminded her that my well was on my deed, and that my deed did not say water resources belonged to her clipboard, but she flipped her hair and declared that the HOA superseded older agreements because modern communities needed modern rules, and her voice got higher and sharper like she was trying to break glass with her confidence, but I pointed out the giant line at the bottom that said this rule only applied to properties developed after HOA establishment, and my property predated the HOA by over a decade, so they had zero authority, but Karen shook her head saying I was twisting words and interfering with official HOA business. I told them if they touched my well I would call the sheriff and file charges for trespassing and attempted theft of private utilities, and that caught the board members off guard, but Karen leaned forward, squinting her eyes, accusing me of trying to intimidate them with fake laws, claiming she had watched enough legal dramas to know how the system worked, and she knew for a fact that wells could not be private because water was communal like sunshine, except the irony was she once tried to block her neighbor's sunlight with a giant fence because their flowers were growing taller than hers, but logic did not live here anymore, so I took out my phone and calmly dialed the sheriff, while staring directly at them, and suddenly they began backing away like raccoons caught digging through trash, except Karen held her ground, insisting she would stay until law enforcement arrived because she wanted to see them take my well away in handcuffs. Instead, when the deputy arrived, he listened to both sides and then asked for property records, which I had already printed out and laminated because I knew this day was coming, and as he looked them over his eyebrows shot up when he realized my well was indeed legally registered and permitted, and that HOA rules did not apply to utilities established prior to their existence, and he told Karen plainly that this was a private water source on private land, and the HOA had no authority over it, and if they attempted to interfere again they could be charged with criminal misconduct. And watching Karen's eyes widen as every word slammed into her entitlement was the most refreshing thing since cold lemonade on a scorching day. But the humiliation did not stop her because she stomped toward the deputy insisting he didn't understand the scope of her authority, and that her HOA legal binder contained more power than county property law, and the deputy simply turned around, walked back to his cruiser, and said he was not dealing with fictional law today, and drove off leaving Karen steaming like a kettle about to explode, and she spun toward me hissing that this was not over because if local law wouldn't help her then she would take it to the state environmental department, claiming my well was contaminating the water table and endangering the entire community, and she stormed off again, typing furiously like an angry court stenographer writing her own downfall. That evening I received an official notice taped to my door claiming pending investigation from environmental authorities, and while I knew everything I had was perfectly legal, a tiny part of me felt annoyed because she was wasting the time of government professionals over a personal power trip. But then something interesting happened, because the state actually cared a lot about independent wells, especially ones predating city infrastructure, so when they saw my file they reached out to me directly asking if I would be open to registering my well as a micro-utility, which would allow the state to formally recognize my water system as a private provider separate from municipal control, and to my surprise they said it could even allow me to sell water rights back to surrounding homeowners if needed, since I had excess supply according to geological surveys from the past. And suddenly her attempt to weaponize the state had accidentally handed me a golden opportunity. When the HOA caught wind of the state evaluation, Karen's panic could be heard across the street because she thought the state would shut me down, not hand me a certificate of independence, and the HOA president started yelling that I was trying to profit off the community and that water should never be sold, especially not by someone who refused to follow HOA rules, and they held an emergency meeting on their porch screaming into a microphone that I was now a threat and needed to be stopped before I created a water monopoly in the neighborhood. The funniest moment arrived when a few neighbors actually came to me quietly asking if they could get some water from my well since the city pressure had been weak lately, and Karen spotted them talking to me and completely lost her mind, yelling betrayal and accusing them of treason against the HOA like she was running a dictatorship and her citizens had dared to drink enemy water, and each passing minute made her look more unhinged, more desperate, and more aware that she was losing control. By the end of the day one thing was crystal clear: the HOA had escalated the fight, but I held the upper hand, because now it wasn't just a well, it was potentially a certified private utility, and Karen, who wanted absolute power, was now staring at the terrifying possibility that she might soon have to pay me for every drop she dreamed of owning, and that was a twist she never saw coming. By the next morning the well no longer felt like a simple source of water, but a battleground of territorial pride, and Karen had transformed into a full-blown surveillance drone patrolling the edge of my property line with the precision of a guard dog obsessed with a squeaky toy, because every time the pump kicked on her head would snap toward my house, and she would whip out her phone filming like she was collecting evidence for a Netflix documentary about evil water hoarders. And while I tried to go about my day pretending her existence didn't matter, the HOA board formed their own little task force holding clipboards and whispering like they were plotting a covert operation, and I caught snippets like unauthorized output, illegal water harvesting, underground distribution network, and at one point the HOA president actually suggested my well was connected to the nearby lake and that I was draining community water, which was hilarious because the lake was 2 miles away uphill. But then again, logic was on permanent vacation here. I knew that if I left things alone they would try something more dangerous, and sure enough around noon I spotted Karen and the HOA treasurer sneaking into my backyard like burglars, except they were terrible at it, stepping on every crunchy leaf and rustling every branch while yelling about finding the switch that shuts off my water before I woke up, and I stepped outside casually with my phone recording and loudly asked if I should bring them lemonade during their trespassing adventure. and they froze in place like wildlife pretending to be invisible, except their bright neon HOA t-shirts made them stand out like street performers, and Karen tried to claim they were conducting an inspection due to public safety concerns regarding the well pump, and they were trained professionals authorized by the association to ensure safety compliance and prevent contamination, but the HOA treasurer was sweating so hard he nearly dropped his clipboard while blinking rapidly as if his eyes were trying to send a distress signal begging me not to call the police. Instead of arguing, I flipped my new security system on, which included bright floodlights, motion sensors, and a loud siren that blared danger trespasser alert in a robotic voice that I absolutely customized for the sole purpose of irritating Karen, and the reaction was priceless because she screamed and tripped over the hose, landing dramatically in my flower bed, while the treasurer ran like he was being chased by a pack of wolves. But Karen stayed down, yelling that she was injured and I was liable. Somehow, because I had created a hostile environment and her legal jargon made less sense every time she opened her mouth. I calmly told her my cameras recorded the entire incident and showed they entered property without permission and attempted to interfere with private utilities, and if she didn't leave I would forward the video to law enforcement and the state, who were already reviewing my well documentation. And Karen scrambled to her feet, brushing dirt off her clothes, while muttering that she would sue me for every penny if those flowers had caused permanent damage to her pride or her knees, and she stomped off, glaring like she was promising revenge through facial expression alone. But the HOA wasn't done, and that night, while I was monitoring the feed from my new outdoor cameras, I caught a group of shadowy figures sneaking near the well again, this time carrying bolt cutters and what looked like duct tape, and I recognized them as Karen's recruits from the HOA fine committee, and watching them fumble in the dark, trying to dismantle the locked control panel, made me shake my head, because they truly believed they had some mission to save the neighborhood from water tyranny. So I called out through the speaker on the camera telling them to say cheese, and they all froze mid-crime like statues caught doing something stupid, and I snapped a photo screenshot, while telling them they had about 3 seconds to leave before the sheriff would be called again, and they scattered, running in all directions like scared pigeons, while Karen, who I had no idea was also hiding nearby, yelled retreat, retreat, which made me laugh so hard I nearly choked, because she said it with the seriousness of a military commander losing a battlefield. The next day the HOA president tried a more official approach, delivering a thick packet of documents claiming that due to community vote they had passed an emergency rule restricting private water extraction and demanding immediate compliance, and I pointed out the signatures box, which had only 3 names, all of which were Karen, the president, and the treasurer, which hardly counted as a democratic vote, but the president argued that those signatures represented leadership, and leadership made decisions, and the community followed, and when I asked who elected them as rulers, she answered proudly that they had volunteered, and no one objected, which somehow in her mind was equal to winning a national election. The situation was escalating fast, but instead of stressing I decided to fight smarter, because I knew state inspectors were scheduled to come evaluate my well for potential utility certification, and I wanted everything perfectly documented so, when the state stepped foot on my property, they would see who was right and who was delusional. And that afternoon 2 government utility specialists arrived wearing bright vests and carrying equipment, while Karen watched from her porch, pacing like an angry rooster ready to peck anyone who dared say I owned my own water. And the inspectors tested the water pressure, the pump capacity, and even commended the well for being in excellent condition, better than many city hookup. Karen immediately marched over, accusing them of supporting illegal water theft and insisting they needed to shut this down, but one inspector politely told her that based on documentation this well was legally owned and maintained and might soon be officially recognized as a standalone private utility, and Karen's jaw dropped open so wide I swear a fly nearly flew in, because she realized the very government she tried to weaponize was now The following days felt like living inside a soap opera where the main villain forgot she wasn't actually in charge of the world, because Karen decided that if friendly meetings and ridiculous accusations didn't work, then brute misuse of authority would, and she announced that a full HOA inspection team would arrive at my house to conduct a mandatory legal investigation into what she now called the greatest water heist in neighborhood history, and I watched in disbelief as 4 board members marched up wearing reflective vests and carrying clipboards like they were government officials, even though 2 of them were the same people who once miscounted parking spaces and tried to fine children for chalk drawings, and as soon as they stepped onto my property I informed them they had no legal right to inspect anything without a warrant, but Karen smugly waved a stack of printed pages saying this was their warrant issued by the HOA Justice Committee, and I nearly choked on air because she had literally invented a court system for herself, and I told her point blank that trespassing under a fake court order was still trespassing, and the only justice she'd get would come from a real judge. When this all blew up, and she rolled her eyes insisting I was scared because I knew my water empire was collapsing, and she ordered her team to take pictures of every pipe, every screw, and every patch of soil, and they did it even though they clearly had no clue what they were photographing, because one of them took a close-up picture of a snail and wrote suspicious under it, as if wildlife was part of my evil operation. Then the state inspectors returned with lab results, and one of them looked amused as he informed Karen in front of everyone that the water quality was excellent, remarkably high purity, no contamination, and absolutely safe, and that the well remained fully compliant with state environmental standards, the complete opposite of what she had been screaming to the neighborhood. And as soon as those words left his mouth, the smirk on Karen's face evaporated, replaced with a twitch in her eye like a glitching robot, and she tried to argue, saying the tests must be wrong because she once smelled something weird while standing near the well, specifically after falling in my flower bed, but the inspector simply nodded politely and said sometimes dirt smells like dirt, and moved on. If humiliation were a flood, Karen would have been drowning, but instead she ramped up the madness because the inspector also revealed something that made her knees wobble. The state was strongly considering classifying my well as a private utility due to its independent infrastructure and stability, and that meant I would become legally recognized as a water provider exempt from HOA jurisdiction, and that the HOA had absolutely no authority over my well now or in the future. And Karen's pupils dilated as she realized that not only had she failed to seize my water, she had accidentally made me more powerful than before, like she had been the villain monologuing while handing me the keys to her doom, and she stuttered that that was impossible because everyone must be under the same water rules. That was just how neighborhoods work, and the inspector told her if she had concerns she could take it up with the state legal department, but the process was already underway and unlikely to be stopped. The moment the inspectors left, Karen started pacing her driveway like a caged tiger on Wi-Fi, scrolling frantically through her phone, probably searching for the most expensive lawyer she could find on a budget of $0, but she quickly resorted to what she knew best, fear-mongering, and she went door to door shouting lies, claiming that soon I would shut off everyone's water and force them to pay a ransom, and that she would save them by rallying community support. But many neighbors had already grown tired of her chaos and slammed their doors or laughed in her face, yet a small group of gullible followers still listened. One of them asked me later if I planned to profit from rainwater next, and I calmly explained that registering the well as a private utility wasn't about charging anyone anything, it was about defending my rights against an HOA attempting something illegal, and the neighbor nodded, saying they trusted me, but admitted Karen made everything sound like a post-apocalyptic water shortage movie. Later that day I caught Karen crawling on her hands and knees near my property line, trying to measure the boundary again because she refused to believe official records, and she declared loudly to no one in particular that the earth itself could not be trusted because the soil might have moved over time, shifting property rights, and my eyes nearly rolled out of my skull as she drew crooked chalk marks and proclaimed them as new borders. But when I stepped outside and told her the survey markers were legally placed years ago. She insisted those markers must have been forged by me in the dead of night, to fool everyone, and I told her she was welcome to hire her own licensed surveyor at her own expense, and she paused, as if she was doing math in her head, and quickly changed the topic, yelling she would bring media attention and expose the truth on television. That night security cameras caught something worse than ever, because Karen and a few board members showed up again trying to shut off the well, but this time they brought tools and a crowbar, and while they worked, Karen narrated like a villain doing a confessional scene, talking about how she would be celebrated as the savior of the HOA once the evil water tyrant was defeated, and I announced through the camera speaker that law enforcement had been notified and that the state was already aware of their repeated attempts at sabotage, and 5 seconds later flashing lights turned the night into a blue and red spectacle as the deputy returned, shaking his head, saying he warned them last time that this was criminal, and Karen started sputtering excuses, claiming she was performing a community rescue mission, and the treasurer pleaded that he was only there for moral support, not crime, but the deputy was in no mood for nonsense, and he wrote them official citations this time, and informed Karen that if she approached the well again she would be arrested. No warnings, no mercy, and she protested that the HOA charter gave her immunity, and the deputy replied immunity doesn't exist in real life, unless you're in a superhero movie, and she fell silent as reality slapped her entitlement right across the face. When the patrol car rolled away, Karen glared at me across the street, holding her citation like it was a flag of war, but her eyes looked different. There was fear there buried under the rage, and she yelled that she would take this to the highest court. She would not allow a dictator well owner to win, and she ran back home clutching her phone like it was her only weapon left, and I stood beside my well listening to the satisfying hum of the pump, knowing the war wasn't over, but the tide was turning sharply, because now the law, the state, and the truth were on my side, and Karen's own actions were digging a deeper hole every day, and soon she would realize one brutal fact: water always finds its level, and in the end so will justice. The next week arrived with the kind of tension you could slice with a shovel, because Karen's panic and desperation had evolved into a full public relations campaign against me, as she printed posters claiming I was illegally running an underground water corporation, sucking the community dry, and she stapled them to every mailbox and tree, even though tampering with mailboxes is a federal crime, but consequences never seem to exist in her universe, and she hosted another emergency HOA rally in her driveway using a borrowed microphone she clearly didn't know how to operate, because it screeched every time she screamed into it, which was every 5 seconds, and she paced back and forth ranting that the state's involvement proved I was under investigation, and that they were days away from shutting me down, and that everyone needed to prepare for a water apocalypse where they would have to bathe with bottled water because of me, and some board members nodded like bobbleheads while others just stood there embarrassed, wishing they were anywhere else, while a few neighbors leaned against cars holding popcorn, watching the show unfold like prime-time drama. Meanwhile, I received official paperwork from the state informing me the investigation was nearing completion, and that everything was leaning in my favor, reinforcing that my well was indeed a legally protected private utility, and they even set a date where I would need to attend a formal hearing to finalize the certification, and that was the moment I knew Karen had just dug her own grave, because the minute I became a recognized utility, the HOA had no say whatsoever, and Karen would not just lose, but lose publicly and loudly, which was the only type of loss she couldn't emotionally survive. But Karen wouldn't go down without one last storm, because she shifted tactics and filed what she called a community environmental emergency, alleging that my well was causing sinkholes, diseased lawns, and dying earthworms, and the state inspector, who returned for follow-up, looked exhausted before he even stepped onto my property, because he had received over 40 emails from Karen in just one night, each one with more dramatic accusations than the last, and he checked the soil, the structure of the well and the land stability, and everything was perfectly normal, no signs of anything remotely harmful, and he even joked that the only environmental hazard was the HOA's constant presence causing verbal pollution in the area, and Karen overheard that and shrieked that he would regret mocking her because she would write directly to the governor, the mayor, the president, and perhaps the United Nations to let the world know about the injustice happening in her neighborhood. The inspector finished his task and told me he would finalize the report soon, and Karen tried blocking his exit, demanding he take additional soil samples specifically from where she claimed the water tasted evil, and he stepped around her, politely refusing, as she threw a tantrum, stomping and yelling that this was a conspiracy and she wouldn't allow corruption to win, and she shouted after him that she would personally ensure he lost his job. And that made the inspector pause, turn, and inform her that threatening a state officer is a criminal offense, and that shut her up, instantly leaving her red-faced and shaking like an overheated kettle. That afternoon I noticed something new. Neighbors who once ignored me were now approaching with questions, but not the paranoid kind, the hopeful kind, because apparently the city water supply had been low pressure for weeks, and they were curious if my well actually produced better water, and if the state certified it, could they possibly pay for access in emergencies or gardening, or maybe even a cheaper alternative to their current bills. And suddenly the story had changed in their minds. I wasn't the villain, I was becoming the unexpected hero, who might help their lawns survive summer heat, and Karen noticed the shift in attitudes, and her meltdown intensified because she could not stand the idea of me gaining support or admiration, especially when her own image was crumbling faster than a stale cookie, and she started screaming that anyone who supported me would be considered a threat to neighborhood order and would face fines and discipline, and someone shouted back that she couldn't fine them for liking their neighbor, and others laughed, which only fueled her fury to a boiling point, where she grabbed her megaphone, threatening to revoke community privileges, whatever that meant, as she stomped around like a dictator whose army had just defected. The breaking point came later that evening when Karen showed up with a lawyer, or at least someone she claimed was a lawyer, but looked suspiciously like her cousin Jim, who previously tried to sell insurance door to door and failed, and he held a briefcase, but when he opened it to retrieve documents he accidentally pulled out a sandwich instead, and tried to hide it quickly, while Karen explained that they were issuing a cease and desist order demanding I shut off my well until the HOA concluded their own separate investigation, and I smiled calmly, telling her that any further attempt to shut my well down would be considered not only trespassing but also interference with a state-regulated utility under review, and that I already had legal representation prepared to pursue damages if she persisted, and Karen's eyes widened with fear for a split second before she forced a confident laugh, insisting that I was bluffing, but the tremble in her voice betrayed her. Later that night, as I checked the mail, I found another notice from the HOA claiming I owed thousands of dollars in fines for unlawful water usage and failure to comply with HOA authority, and I realized this wasn't just petty harassment anymore. They were trying to bankrupt me into submission, and that crossed a line that triggered something very cold inside me, because if they wanted a legal war, then I would bring one to their doorstep and crush them with their own rules and laws they didn't even understand. And I took all their fake documents, scanned them, and emailed everything to the state legal team along with security footage reports and witness statements, and within hours I received a message from the state indicating they were escalating this case due to HOA interference with a protected resource, and that subpoenas might be issued if the harassment continued. As the night deepened, quiet fell for the first time in days, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath waiting for the next strike, and I stood beside my well listening to the steady pumping that symbolized independence, freedom, and defiance, and I realized Karen had lost the battle the moment she picked a fight not with me but with the law, and soon she wouldn't just lose control, she would owe me apologies, fines, maybe even money for damages, because the first rule of any war is to know your enemy, and Karen assumed I was just another neighbor she could bully into obedience, but she never realized she was attacking someone who would rather go to war than give up a single drop of his own water, and the tide had turned completely, because now she wasn't just fighting me, she was fighting reality, and reality was about to hit her harder than a fire hose on full pressure. The day of the state utility hearing arrived like the final showdown in a Western movie, except instead of tumbleweeds and cowboy hats we had stacks of paperwork and angry HOA members glaring like vultures waiting for scraps, because Karen had gathered her entire board to attend the hearing, as if she believed her presence alone would sway government officials, and she came dressed in what she clearly thought was a powerful legal outfit, a blazer with too many pins on it and a giant binder that she struggled to carry but refused to put down since it represented what she believed were unbreakable HOA laws, while I simply walked in with my property deed registration documents, state compliance files, and the confidence of someone who actually knew what he was talking about, because facts have a way of slicing through nonsense like a hot knife through butter. And when we were called into the meeting room, Karen stormed ahead, making sure to sit as close to the front as possible so she could stare down every official like she was the hero of the story instead of the antagonist unraveling in full view. The state compliance officer began the session calmly reviewing the findings and confirming that the well met every safety requirement, exceeded expected standards, and had full legal protection due to its historical establishment predating the HOA, and Karen shot to her feet before he could even finish, accusing the officer of being bribed and demanding that the HOA rules be recognized as superior, since she claimed the HOA Constitution was the true law of the land, and the room fell silent as everyone absorbed the sheer absurdity of her argument, while the officer stared at her in disbelief before explaining slowly, as if speaking to a child, that HOA rules were essentially neighborhood agreements, not binding state or federal law, and certainly could not override property rights protected decades earlier. And Karen began flipping through her binder, frantically pointing to random pages, yelling about fairness, community order, and unified watering practices, but the officer reminded her that private wells are not community property even if found within HOA boundaries, and the HOA could not seize or manage utilities without explicit legal transfer. And her mouth opened and closed repeatedly like a fish trying to breathe air, as the realization hit her that her authority meant nothing here. When it was my turn to speak, I simply presented the timeline of events, including videos of trespassing attempts, sabotage efforts, harassment, and false reports Karen had filed, and I took no pleasure in watching her face whiten like paper as each piece of evidence exposed her intentions and her reckless actions, and the officer scribbled notes quickly, his expression turning from neutral to frustrated, especially when the footage showed Karen leading nighttime raids with tools aimed at damaging critical water systems, and he asked if I intended to pursue charges because what she had done was not only harassment but potentially felony property interference, and as that word felony echoed through the room, Karen let out a squeak of panic before yelling that everything she did was purely for public safety, and that she was a hero protecting people from water dictatorship, and the officer shut her down, reminding her that actual public safety concerns are handled by licensed professionals, not self-appointed neighborhood monarch. Finally, after reviewing all information, the officer announced the decision: the well would be officially registered as a private utility under state protection and oversight, meaning the HOA had zero influence, zero authority, and zero rights over it, and if they attempted control again, the state could take legal action against them. And Karen's shoulders slumped, as if someone had removed the batteries from her delusional power source. And before she could protest again, the officer added one more beautiful detail: the HOA must reimburse me for any costs incurred due to their interference, including legal consultations, repairs to the security upgrades caused by their tampering, and administrative fees from responding to frivolous complaints. And the way Karen gasped, you would think she had been stabbed by paperwork, because the idea of paying me for anything, especially water, hurt her pride more than any fine ever could. After the meeting ended, we walked outside, and several neighbors approached to congratulate me, shaking my hand, thanking me for standing up to the HOA tyranny, while Karen stood frozen near the exit, trying to process the brutal defeat she had just witnessed, and the HOA president whispered frantically to her, asking what they should do now, but Karen just stared ahead, eyes empty, as if the ground had crumbled beneath her entire identity, built on control and fear, and she muttered that this wasn't the end, that she would find another way because she didn't lose, she was simply misunderstood, and as she shuffled away clutching her binder like a lifeline, I realized the war was not fully over, but her army was falling apart and the state victory had stripped away her most powerful weapon, false authority. When I returned home, the neighborhood atmosphere had changed. Small groups chatted openly about how sick they were of Karen's rules, and how this case had shown that the HOA was abusing its power, and some even hinted at voting to replace the leadership entirely, and every time Karen walked outside people avoided her, instead of following her, and she looked smaller now, not physically but in presence, as if the spotlight she once demanded now burned her instead of glorifying her, and yet that didn't stop her last desperate attempts, because a few nights later footage showed her standing across the street staring at my well, muttering to herself about injustice and conspiracy, and how water should be shared among all like a sacred gift, and she clenched her fists, making promises to the moon that she would restore balance. But the irony was, while she obsessed over control, she had accidentally created a new opportunity for everyone in the community, because now that the well was state-registered, I had the legal right to offer water services privately, and a handful of neighbors approached me the following day asking if I would allow them to connect in the future for emergencies, since water bills from the city kept rising, and sometimes their supply was shut off during maintenance, and I agreed, tentatively saying if the need arose I would be happy to help, and they thanked me with genuine appreciation, the kind Karen always wanted but never earned, and as I watched them walk away happily, something settled deep inside me, knowing that this entire ordeal had revealed the true character of people around me, the ones who pretend to serve the community, and the ones who actually do. Karen wanted this battle, she sought it with every fiber of her oversized ego, and yet the outcome was a complete flip of everything she intended. I wasn't the one controlled by the HOA, I was the one now operating above it, recognized by the state, while she was nothing more than a neighbor with a clipboard and a rapidly shrinking crowd, and though she still paced and plotted, she couldn't change the fact that water rights had sunk her and there was no lifeline left except the fading echo of her complaints, swallowed up by the sound of my well pump working peacefully. Strong proof that I wasn't just protecting my water anymore, I was protecting my freedom, and the freedom of everyone tired of being bullied by someone who confused power with entitlement. Neighbors say pressure breaks pipes, but in my neighborhood pressure was breaking Karen, because after the state decision she spiraled into a meltdown that could be heard 3 blocks away, and in a final desperate attempt to regain control she called an emergency HOA reformation meeting, claiming the community was under attack by a rogue water dealer who planned to turn every faucet into a coin slot, and she screamed through her megaphone that if they didn't act now the neighborhood would soon be at my mercy, and I would rule like a self-appointed water baron, demanding payments for showers and sprinklers, and the absurdity would have been hilarious if she wasn't dragging everyone into her personal collapse. But instead of rallying fear this time, her speech was met mostly with groans, eye rolls, and a few neighbors whispering that they needed popcorn because this show wasn't slowing down anytime soon. And as the crowd dispersed without voting on anything, Karen's anger boiled into a storm that made even the HOA president take a step away from her, refusing to be associated with what looked like the unraveling of a tyrant. Meanwhile, the state finalized the paperwork faster than expected and delivered the official certificate confirming my well as a private utility, fully recognized, protected, and independent of HOA jurisdiction permanently, which meant the HOA no longer even had a theoretical chance of grabbing control. And when that document touched my hands, I felt a satisfaction that words could barely capture, because not only had I protected what was mine, but I had cornered Karen with the thing she feared most: accountability. And then, like a spark hitting dry grass, word spread quickly that neighbors could request supplemental water access in the summer if needed through proper agreements, and some of them approached excitedly to express gratitude and offer support, and Karen saw this and exploded like a badly shaken soda can as she yelled that anyone who took water from me would be aiding a criminal enterprise, and that she would file fines on them so high their houses would cry. But the neighbors laughed, because everyone now understood she had no actual authority left, and her threats were nothing but empty noise fading in the wind. Real panic hit when a letter arrived for the HOA board from the state's legal department informing them that Karen's interference had triggered a review of the HOA's authority and numerous violations had surfaced, including misuse of power, harassment, illegal fines, and attempts to tamper with utility infrastructure, meaning the HOA itself was officially under investigation and could face dissolution. And Karen read the document aloud but stumbled through the legal parts and collapsed into a rant, claiming the state was corrupt and that I had brainwashed officials, and now she was being unfairly targeted for simply defending the community. And the HOA president tried to calm her, but she pushed him away, accusing him of betrayal, saying he should have stood stronger with her instead of letting legal facts crush their dreams of total control. The investigation into the HOA spread quickly, and more neighbors spoke up, sharing their stories of petty fines, absurd rules, and years of bullying from Karen and her close board members. And some residents admitted they had been too scared to push back before, but seeing me win against her inspired them to finally take a stand, and meetings that Karen once controlled turned into forums for neighbors demanding the removal of corrupt leadership and restoration of basic rights. And I could see the terror in Karen's eyes every time someone mentioned voting her out, because she wasn't just losing the water battle, she was losing her entire identity and the power she clung to like oxygen. In response, Karen tried new tactics like calling code enforcement, claiming my house was violating structural rules because my garden hose was too colorful and didn't match the approved HOA aesthetic, and she even accused my lawn of being too green, suspiciously lush, and potentially nourished by illegal water enhancements. But every report she filed bounced back with notes stating the HOA no longer had jurisdiction over me and that repeated false complaints could result in charges, and she screamed in frustration, but the world was no longer listening to her because she didn't have authority anymore, she just had volume. The turning point came at a massive neighborhood meeting called by residents, not the HOA, and dozens of people showed up demanding the immediate resignation of Karen and the board, and the HOA president tried to defend himself, but every sentence was drowned out by angry voices listing years of harassment, from petty fines for mailbox flower pots to writing violation notices for having the wrong shade of blue on holiday decorations. And Karen stood up, trying to shout them down, waving her binder, screaming they needed her leadership or the neighborhood would collapse into chaos. But someone yelled that the only chaos came from her, and a chorus of agreement followed like roaring thunder, and she slammed the binder shut, shaking and snarling at everyone, calling them ungrateful rule breakers who didn't deserve her guidance. A vote was held right there on the sidewalk, clipboards passed from hand to hand, and within minutes the results were undeniable. Karen and her allies were removed from their positions with overwhelming majority, and the cheers that erupted were so loud she covered her ears like the noise physically hurt her, and she stared at the papers in disbelief, refusing to accept reality, insisting the vote was illegal, tampered, fraudulent, and that she was still in control. But no one respected her demands anymore, and the HOA files were taken from her possession by newly elected board members who promised transparency, fairness, and zero harassment policies, and Karen tried to snatch them back, but failed miserably, and the new president turned his back on her, completely shutting her out of the authority she once abused. As she stormed away shaking with pure rage, a group of neighbors approached me smiling, saying this was the beginning of a better chapter for the community, and I agreed, feeling lighter than I had in months, but also knowing that Karen wasn't the type to go quietly into the night, because she still believed she was right and everyone else was wrong. And as I stood by my well listening to the constant hum of victory, I saw Karen sitting alone at her driveway curb, binder clutched against her chest, glaring at my property with the venom of a defeated villain plotting one final act of revenge. Yet her power was gone, her army dispersed, and the community she once terrorized was finally free, ready to rebuild without her absurd rules weighing on their backs. And the war over water was nearing its final end, with the biggest twist still waiting just around the corner, a twist she would never have imagined in her wildest delusional dreams, because soon the HOA that tried to steal my well would be the one begging me for access to it. The sun rose on a calmer neighborhood, but inside Karen's head a hurricane was still spinning, because even though the HOA had been stripped of power and she had been officially removed from her position, she refused to accept defeat, and she spent her mornings pacing her driveway talking to herself about justice and fairness and conspiracies against her like a dethroned queen who still believed she ruled the castle, but no matter how much she screamed, the world had already moved on because with the HOA transformed under new leadership, the community was free from Karen's rule, and neighbors walked their dogs without fear of being fined for leash length or grass height, and kids rode bikes without thinking a clipboard would appear from nowhere to ruin their fun, and people actually began treating me like a hero because the victory with the well had sparked a chain reaction that restored freedom across the neighborhood, and some even suggested throwing a block party to celebrate the end of Karen's dictatorship, though everyone knew she would probably try to crash it screaming about bylaws, so they planned a quiet celebration, instead with friendly smiles and shared relief that the nightmare was almost behind them. But the most satisfying moment came when the newly elected HOA board requested a meeting with me in my yard, not to lecture me, not to threaten me, but to discuss something entirely unexpected because the city had announced a temporary reduction in water pressure for maintenance that could affect the homes on our street, and the new board politely asked whether my private utility could temporarily supply water to those who opted in, ensuring nobody suffered during the city's repairs, and I stood they're holding their request form, realizing the poetic justice of it. All the HOA that once tried to seize my well and make me pay them for using my own water was now asking me to provide them with water and do it legally and respectfully, and I agreed with clear terms, fair pricing, and proper safety checks because unlike Karen, I wasn't out for revenge, I was out for balance, and the new board signed gratefully knowing this arrangement would help many neighbors and save them from shortages. When the temporary connections were installed, neighbors thanked me again, shaking my hand, offering homemade cookies, fresh fruit, even help with yard work as appreciation gestures I didn't expect but fully welcomed because it felt good to be valued instead of villainized, and as I watched water flowing from my well into the homes of those who needed it, I realized something important. I wasn't just defending my rights anymore, I was proving that independence doesn't mean isolation, and sometimes having something others lack gives you the power to help, not harm, and that was a type of victory far greater than anything Karen could ever understand. And speaking of Karen, she was not handling this new reality well. In fact, she took it worse than any punishment she could have received because the idea that the same water she tried to control was now legally supporting the neighborhood without her approval shattered her ego completely, and one evening she stormed across the street shouting at the new HOA board demanding they shut off the water because a neighborhood depending on a private utility was against everything she believed in, and she accused them of colluding with me behind her back, but they calmly explained to her that she had no authority, and if she continued harassing homeowners she would face legal action, and she responded by declaring that the neighborhood had fallen into chaos without her guidance, and she dramatically pointed at a neighbor's garden hose claiming the angle it lay at was a sign of system failure, and she lunged toward the temporary water valve, threatening to turn it off, but the new president firmly blocked her path and told her she was trespassing again and that the sheriff would be called if she didn't go home, and for the first time ever Karen stepped back, not because she agreed, but because even she finally understood that the line she had been crossing for months was now electrified with consequences. As days passed, her behavior shifted from frantic rage to quiet bitterness. She stopped yelling publicly and instead started sending long rambling letters to various government offices claiming she was the victim of mass injustice and betrayal, but none of them responded because everyone was exhausted from her nonsense, and eventually her complaints bounced back unopened or ignored, and the energy she once used to boss people around now kept her trapped in her own anger like a cage built from entitlement and isolation, and while she sulked in silence, the rest of the neighborhood flourished in peace. My well became a symbol of resilience and independence, and soon the temporary connections turned into a lasting option for those who wanted it, not because they were forced but because they trusted me more than they trusted an HOA ever again. And as I looked at the official certificate hanging framed inside my home, I felt a sense of pride deeper than the well itself, the knowledge that doing the right thing even against overwhelming pettiness can reshape a community for the better. Months later the state inspector returned for a routine check, and he congratulated me on maintaining excellent water quality, and joked that if every homeowner fought like I did he would be out of a job because there would be no scandals left to investigate, and while he laughed, he also reminded me that property rights matter more than the loud voices trying to control them, and that I had one not just for myself but for everyone living here, and I shook his hand thanking him for helping stand against nonsense dressed as authority. That evening I stood by the well again listening to the steady hum of the pump pulling clear clean water from the depths below, and I thought about the crazy journey that had started with Karen screaming that my water belonged to her kingdom of HOA insanity, and how her relentless attempt to seize what wasn't hers had backfired so perfectly that she ended up powerless, humiliated, and surrounded by people who finally saw her truth, and, as I took a deep breath, a final slice of satisfaction washed over me, knowing that every drop of water flowing into this neighborhood was now a reminder that freedom always triumphs over control, and that the only person who drowned was the one who tried to steal the sea.